Thank you so much. So pleased to be here. And I'd like to introduce the other panelists, General Darren McDew, retired Air Force, 30 plus years of service, and retired many planes during that time. And then I'd also like to welcome Mr. Harvey Mason Jr., the interim CEO and president, as well as the board chair of the Recording Academy, which to most of us, we know that to be the Grammys. So it's much bigger than that, but that's to the novice what we realize. And I want to give a tidbit about Mr. Mason that I think is really cool, so I want to share it, which is number one, I read you wrote your first song at 8 years old.
That's
And
true.
yeah, and number two, which is really, really cool, I think, and I think it's true. I put it together myself, which is you probably are the only man who has a Grammy and who also participated as a college athlete basketball in the NCAA Final Four basketball for University of Arizona. So I think,
Possibly.
yeah, I think,
Possibly.
yeah, that sets you apart. And so that is just one example of how diversity plays in a lot of fields. I mean, as I say, I think that really sets you apart. And so today, what we're really interested and excited to talk about, as today is the funeral for Congressman John Lewis, is really what his life was about, which is getting into good trouble and really saying, let's think about inclusive diversity. Let's think about how we can move it from where it is further. Let's think about what's the mindset shift that needs to happen. As I've been attending the conference for 2 days, yesterday, one of the speakers says, it's not an innovation problem, it's an adaptation problem. And I think that that relates very much to diversity and inclusion. And so I like that as we talk, that people think about what is the mindset shift that you need to make in order to really bring diverse and inclusive teams into your workplace. And so we're going to spend our time talking about that, having the benefit of these two leaders to talk about their experience and their what they know works, some lessons they've learned that maybe can be helpful to you. So I'd like to start with you, General, and ask you to share, why do you think that the investment that's been made in diversity and inclusion has not returned the commensurate return on the investment?
Well, Raquel, first let me thank you very much for leading this effort here. And I wish the entire audience and everybody listening could have participated in the session that the three of us had a few days ago, where we had more than an hour of just conversation about a number of things. And I learned a ton from that. I also want to say how humbled I am to be on this kind of stage with the two of you and all of your accomplishments. And I want to point out very quickly that Mr. Mason was very quick to point out that he wasn't the 30 some odd year old military dude. He was the younger guy. He waved when you gave his introduction to make sure everybody, everybody knew who the old dude was and who the not so old dude is. So, but thank you very much. But as we talked about a little bit last week, I think one of the reasons it hasn't taken on as much, and we have to acknowledge some progress,
Absolutely.
because a lot of organizations struggle, and I'm biased about this, and I think it's a purely leadership issue. There's a lot of things that factor in, but there are a lot of people that have not fully invested in the one problem and two, the solution. It's very easy to say, I want a diversity organization, but if the leader of the organization isn't involved and leading that effort, it really can't go very far.
And so, do you have some examples of when you, as a leader, had difficulty pushing it through? I mean, I see you when you were in active service as you were really the leader of leaders,
I don't
meaning,
know. I don't know if I'd go that far.
well, really meaning, I mean, you're the general, so
Yeah.
everything follows from you. And so I'm wondering, do you have some examples where you had leaders, in fact, say, I believe in it, but I'm concerned, or they didn't say it, but you could tell by their action that they weren't bought into it.
Well, I've had some directly tell me, I don't believe in diversity. And when you get to talking to them about what their definition of diversity is, many of them talk about quotas. Many of them talk about unqualified people ascending to ranks that they have no business being in. And some of it comes down to a little bit of ignorance and a little bit of what they have read or listened to in other people and pundits. And what they don't understand is that there are sometimes barriers to that qualified person getting in front of you. So, one of the things I instituted in one of my commands is you are empowered to hire your people. However, at a certain level, I want you to talk to me about the candidates you're looking at and why you're selecting the person you're selecting. And then I also added, never ever select the wrong person for the wrong reason. I.e., don't come to me and say you've selected a diversity candidate who's not qualified, because that puts the entire movement behind if the person isn't successful. But I also say there are people out there with qualifications that have a chance to succeed that need to be put in front of you so that you can make that judgment.
And so I appreciate that. Mr. Mason, do you have that experience in your industry where there's people who believe that they're it's fine to be diverse and inclusive when you're an artist, but now on the business side, we need to not have that same mindset that maybe they're not qualified?
I don't know if anyone's really had the heart or the guts to tell me that to my face, actually, but I'm sure there's people that think that, right? Um, we do have some diversity, quite a bit of diversity in the creative side of our business. I think we're still working on it. We've got ways to go as far as gender equality and things like that. But on the executive side, a lot of it's just education. Like, we don't educate the people that are making the decisions around what's happening in the world today and in our experience. A lot of people don't feel that there is a need for improvement because they just don't know. I don't like to hand it to or pass it off to people not being good people. I have a hard time like just justifying that. I think people are good people. I think when the majority of people find out that there's a real issue, and the issue is stemming from things that they're not even aware of, they might be contributing to it or they might not be contributing to it. But once they're aware of the issue and they understand it in all of its complexities, I tend to believe, and I like to believe, that they would make real action to change it. So for me, I think it's about education and informing and amplifying the message. And I think that's what we're seeing right now in these latest days. Over the last couple of months, you're seeing a lot of people come to like a realization, have a moment like, oh man, something's really wrong. Something's very upsettingly wrong. And I'm probably getting the same phone calls you guys are getting from my friends of other races and saying, I had no idea. What can I do to help? I didn't realize that this was happening. I didn't realize that was happening. So I think that's more of what I'm seeing, Raquel.
Appreciate that. And I am getting those calls, and I am with you also, Mr. Mason, that the intent is positive by most people. So the business case has been made. More diverse, inclusive teams perform better. So I think that whatever stereotype people had that, well, you won't perform, I think that's been laid aside. But I do think that we're talking about change, and we're talking about personal change. And so that means if I have to change, it's not that easy. I always say there's only one person that likes change, and it's a baby when they're wet. Everybody else, we talk about we want to change, but it's not that easy to change. And so I think, General, as you talk about, someone actually being honest and being able to say to you, here's my concerns with it. And then you being able to, in some way, change the system a bit to give them the incentive to learn along the way that I'm not going to ask you to hire someone that can't do the job. And I think that that's an interesting way for a leader to lead someone to say, I'm not going to force you, but I'm going to strongly encourage you to change your mindset. And so, what other things, General, do you think leaders could do to move this process of diversity and to make their processes be more inclusive? I know as we talk, the military is a bit more hierarchical, and so inclusion sometimes is difficult in that kind of structure.
When you say a bit more, that's being
Is that
quite
an
generous.
oxymoron?
It's exactly hierarchical on purpose and actually with intent. But I'm going to challenge you a little bit on the case has been made for diverse teams perform as well or better. I think the case has been made, but I don't believe everybody believes that.
Fair.
Therefore, the problem. So in the military and outside the military system is different in this regard. There's one way in, and then you have whatever your input is, you have to produce those people along the way. There's only one way to get a 20-year colonel in the military, and that's to have developed them for 20 years. In corporate America, which I sit like you on a couple of corporate boards, if you want a 20-year executive, you can go poach them
Right.
from somewhere else and never have to develop them. So one of the problems with the developmental problem is that many organizations are very poor because they don't need to be better at developing people to become executives because they just feel as though they can get them someplace else. Even when they try to develop, the upskilling of their managers isn't to become leaders, isn't sufficient enough so that it disproportionately impacts minorities and people of color. The other thing that's not realized in some organizations is that diversity is race, gender, ethnicity, but it's also more than that. Some people like to talk about diversity of thought, and I'm okay with that, but I don't like to use that as a cop-out because you can't measure it. The other pieces of diversity that I tried to measure were underrepresented career fields. So if you have an engineering organization, your center of your bullseye are other engineers. And you have to look at that cohort to see how diverse that cohort is. And then if that cohort feeds your upper echelon of management, then if there's no diversity in that cohort, how do you bring the other career fields, the other people into your leadership team to bring diversity from that aspect in as well?
And so, Mr. Mason, at the recording industry, what are some of the things that I know as the interim CEO you're working on changing to foster, as you said, you're not as equitable in the gender area? What are some things you've got your eye on?
We actually have our eye on everything. We're looking across the entire organization as to how we find how we find new members and how we recruit new members, to how we constitute our boardroom and how we elect our elected leaders within the boardroom, how we hire people on the staff, how we do our awards, our representation on the television show. We really literally are looking at everything. And I ran as chair of the board about a year ago and was elected really on my platform of change and improvement. And that was kind of the way I thought I needed to come into the organization, was let's look at everything we do. So now as interim president and CEO, I have the ability to really make some changes and do it rather quickly, which is a really unique opportunity, having me holding both the board seat and the president CEO seat. So it gives us a great chance to really make some great changes and start in a really cool direction. So I'm excited about it.
Well, and I'd say, as you said, you're looking at everything. I mean, I think that's the difference. That in my mind is why the investments that so many organizations have made have not generated returns, because they've been so specific, only looking at, for instance, recruiting, getting the people into the organization, but not changing anything inside of the organization. So people, don't find it inclusive, don't find it what they've been sold. So
It's
bravo.
really the culture. Yeah, that's the culture, and it's everything that we do. I have to say we've made some great steps even before I started, but I just really feel like some of the things we're doing now are at that level. They're the real deep core of who we are is changing, whether that's in the office and how we run our staff and our processes, but also just externally membership, events, things we're putting together. We just started a Black Music Coalition for the first time in the history of the 63-year-old organization that is really based on the bedrock of music, but specifically Black music. So these are the types of things that really go to the core of the organization, and I think permeate everything we do. My hope is that it will.
And in closing, as we have only a few minutes, I wonder if both of you, starting with General, if you share, what are some lessons learned? What is the advice you'd give to everyone at the conference on if they're really, really serious about making a big change and getting the results that they know will contribute to innovation? And if they don't know, trust us that it will contribute to innovation. So what's your advice? What are the lessons?
Well, I feel somewhat inadequate, but I've failed at a number of things. So it gives me an opportunity to tell you the things that I know can work. And I'm an example of some of those things. First of all, you don't have to look like the person you're mentoring and growing to be successful in mentoring and growing them. If that was the case, I wouldn't have achieved the rank of 4-star general, because there were very few people in the flying business when I started and in my path along the way that looked like me. My very first supervisor gave me the model for how to get it done for a person of color, or actually any person along the way. He acted like and treated me like he was a leader, and he expected me to be a leader. He challenged me to develop. He pushed me in areas that I didn't think were all that important. But what did I know? I was brand new to the organization. And then as a receiver of that, you have to acknowledge that maybe you don't know everything you need to know. And then he communicated clearly to me what expectations were. And he set them higher than he thought I could achieve. And I clawed to get there. And he got to know me as a person, and got to understand what my goals and objectives were for my life, both personally and professionally. And then he helped chart a path to get me there. And surprisingly, this is a white guy from Maine, Vietnam era guy who had no other compelling reason to do this other than he was a leader who felt that the organization would be better if I was to get better.
And you, Mr. Mason?
It's a really great question. And I think there's two ways to look at this. One's probably more ideological than the other, but I look at it in a couple of ways. Number one, being more diverse and inclusive, it feels good. It's the right thing to do. And I know that sounds a little corny, but we know it's the right thing to do. Treating other people the right way is the right thing to do. And also, it's very, very good for your business. You're going to make better decisions, as you said. You're going to have a more well-rounded experience in your business or in your organization. You're going to get different perspectives. You're going to get different input, different kind of collaboration. And that's really, really important to the success of any organization. And the flip side of that, and the other way to look at it is, and this is not as cool, but we're in a different world. And if you are not adopting diversity and inclusion, you are going to be left on the outside. And I think it's going to be unfortunate for any organization that's not paying close attention to that. And I think you're going to be in a disadvantage, not only as far as the creative and what you're producing and the ideas that you're coming with, but also just as far as the perception and the optics and you're not going to be perceived as a forward-looking, forward-facing organization. And that also is very, very important, not only to your bottom line, to the business, but also just to the ethos and the expectation of your organization. I think in both ways, it makes total sense to be diverse, inclusive, and have equity among in everything you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. And I hope that we've left the audience with the idea that leadership is everything. Diversity and inclusion is everyone's business, starting with the leader, and either jump on or be extinct. I think, Mr. Mason, that's basically what you're saying. The days of staying the same have passed us. So
Over.
appreciate you all being part of this, and hoping we gave the audience something to think about.
Thank you all very much. It was great to be here. Really appreciate it.